Beneath the waning sun, the 7 hills of Rome stood cloaked in solemn majesty, their shadows stretching like ancient sentinels across the Tiber's gleaming thread. On the Palatine, towers of stone clung to the sky as if in defiance of time, and atop them ruled a king not cloaked in wisdom but veiled in dread. Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, bore no crown forged of honor. His throne was carved from fear, his court steeped in silence. The final king of Rome ruled as though the gods themselves had fallen silent, leaving only the hiss of ambition to echo through his marble halls. Justice found no voice under his rule. Law was a servant to his will, and virtue, a relic buried beneath his granite temples. His ascent had not come through rite or ceremony, but through the blood of kin. He had driven his own father-in-law, Servius Tullius, into the dust, his lifeless form cast into the streets like refuse, and his daughter Tarquin's wife had trampled the fallen king's corpse beneath her chariot's wheels. In the house of Tarquin, blood was not sacred. It was a currency spent without remorse. And yet it was not the king's hand that would unravel the house of kings, but that of his son. Sextus Tarquinius, prince by title but beast by hunger, was a man whose soul had turned inward, devoured by shadows of greed and unspeakable desire. He was not content to rule lands or lead armies. He wished to own what could not be owned: virtue, honor, the sacred dignity of the undefiled. It was in the quiet of night that the evil was done. The firelight danced upon polished stone, flickering like a warning no one would heed. In a home far from the palace, a home adorned not in opulence but in grace, Lucretia lived. The wife of Collatinus, cousin to the king, she was praised across Rome for her chastity, her kindness, her noble restraint. The matrons whispered of her goodness, the men envied her husband's fortune, and Sextus, hearing of her, hungered. He came not with a sword drawn, but with lies wrapped in civility. A guest beneath her roof, he feigned honor, masking the wolf beneath the robe of kinship. And when the household slept and silence blanketed the night, he rose like death from his bed and slipped into hers. Steel glinted in the dark, a dagger, cold as fate, pressed against the throat of a woman who had never once betrayed her vow. She did not scream. No cry broke the night. There was only breath, fast and panicked, and the slow crushing of the soul beneath the weight of tyranny. He did not come for her love. He came for power, for conquest over the unconquered. He whispered threats. If she did not yield, he would kill her, then place her body beside that of a slain slave, claiming she had been caught in lewd betrayal. She would not only die, she would die shamed. And so, stripped of every defense, she submitted, not to lust but to terror, not to a man but to the madness of the empire. By dawn, Sextus was gone, returned to the palace of kings with nothing but silence in his wake. But the silence would not hold. Lucretia, radiant in mourning, summoned her father, her husband, and 2 of Rome's noblest men. She did not weep, she did not plead. She told them what had been done plainly, with the grace of one who had already stepped beyond life's edge. And then before their eyes she drew forth a dagger. The same steel that had once threatened her now lay in her own hand. She placed it to her heart. "For I am not guilty of sin," she said, "but I will not give license to the unchaste. No woman shall live shamed by what I endured and call it virtue." And with that she fell, blood blooming upon her robes like a final rose. Her body slumped not in weakness but in victory, for her death would not be the end, it would be the beginning. In that moment something ancient awoke in the hearts of Roman men, something older than kings, deeper than blood. Brutus, kinsman to the Tarquins, had long feigned foolishness to survive the court of a tyrant. But now he rose with fire in his voice and a dagger of vengeance in his hand. He held Lucretia's lifeless form for all to see and cried to the heavens and the earth, "No more shall Rome kneel to kings, by this blood we swear it." What began as grief ignited into an uprising. The streets filled with cries not of mourning but of wrath. The people had endured taxation, torture, and tyranny, but now they saw the crown not as a symbol of order but of rape. The sins of a single prince became the shame of an entire monarchy. The gates of Rome no longer opened to the Tarquins. One by one, their allies vanished. The city, once cowed into obedience, became a furnace of rebellion. The king fled, the prince vanished into exile, and in their place a silence unlike any before, not the silence of fear, the silence of freedom. From the ashes of monarchy, a new Rome stirred. The Republic was born not in council chambers or parchment treaties, but in blood and rage, and in the vow that no man would again wear a crown in the eternal city. But liberty is not peace. It is fire aflame to be fed, controlled, guarded, and the fire had only just been lit. The Senate rose like an ancient god summoned from stone to guide this new order. 2 consuls were elected, rulers by term, not by blood. Power would be divided, law would be sacred, no king, no tyrant, only Rome. Yet the walls of the city are still remembered. They remembered Tarquin's name etched in fear. They remembered Lucretia's scream, silent though it was, and they remembered that men do not forget power so easily. Brutus, now one of the first consuls, led with the weight of sacred vengeance. But vengeance breeds echoes. Even as the Tarquins languished in exile, they conspired. Word spread of plots, of assassins hidden in alleyways, of royal bloodlines stirring beyond the border. Rome was no longer ruled by a man, but it was not yet free from his shadow. And so the city held its breath. The Republic was not a birth, but a reckoning, a test of whether virtue could stand where fear had fallen. Every law passed was a stone laid upon a grave, every oath sworn a challenge to the ghosts of kings. Beneath the forum's open sky, voices rose in debate and decree, no longer chained by decree of one. Yet even here ambition lingered. The robes had changed. The thrones had vanished. But in the eyes of some, the dream of singular power flickered still. In the name of liberty, a republic was carved from the bones of tyranny. But liberty, like virtue, must be defended. It must be chosen again and again against every temptation to crown another Caesar. For the iron hand of power, once loosened, does not vanish. It waits in silence. The sun rose over Rome like a blade of fire, severing night from day, silence from storm. And where once had stood the broken body of a noblewoman, now stood the wrath of a nation. Her blood had not dried, her spirit had not passed. It surged, it called, it demanded justice from stone and man alike. Brutus, once a shadow among the living, a man who had played the fool in the halls of kings to mask the weight of ancient purpose, now stood unveiled. The mask of madness was cast aside, and in its place fury carved from virtue. He held the dagger that had stilled Lucretia's heart, but it was not a weapon now, it was a covenant. In the open air of the Roman streets, Brutus's voice rose not as one but as many, for through him spoke every silence ever endured beneath the cruelty of a throne. He stood upon the sacred stones of the Forum and summoned the people not as subjects but as heirs of destiny. He named the crimes, he named the kings, he spoke of Servius slain by betrayal and Lucretia undone by power's most vile touch. And as his voice rang through the square like the tolling of a funeral bell, the crowd did not murmur, it roared. The fire had found breath. It was not a war of armies, it was a storm of hearts. A reckoning born not from strategy, but from sorrow and rage braided as one. No edict fell, no vote was cast in solemn peace. Rome's monarchy did not descend in ceremony, it collapsed in thunder. Tarquinius Superbus, the last to wear the crown, was driven from his palace by walls that no longer recognized him. The Capitoli no longer bowed to his tread. The temples closed their doors to his offerings. He fled not as a king, but as a shadow chased by the very silence he had sown. And behind him the people gathered not with gold or garlands, but with iron and flame. The monarchy, once upheld by 1,000 whispered fears, was now surrounded by a single cry, never again. The chains of lineage were shattered. The cloak of divinity, torn from the shoulders of rulers who once pretended to speak for the gods, now lay in the dust. Brutus, Collatinus, and the other defenders of virtue did not build a palace. They built a vow that Rome would never again belong to one man. And so the Republic emerged, raw and radiant, like dawn from the ashes of a tyrant's pyre. But new suns do not banish old shadows so easily. Even as the first consuls were sworn, as the fasces were handed to men not born to rule but chosen by duty, the breath of the kings lingered in the air. The Tarquins, scattered into exile, were not silent. They whispered across borders, schemed in foreign courts, traded their dignity for daggers. Rome's freedom, young and trembling, stood on a blade's edge. Then came the first test, not from outside but from within. Nobles with ties to the Tarquins, veins still pulsing with royal ambition, plotted to bring the king back. Letters sealed in wax, promises written in treason, a quiet treachery stirred beneath Rome's sacred stones. But Rome had changed. The plot was discovered. Names once revered were unveiled as traitors, and among them Brutus's own sons. Fate is cruelest to those who walk its edge. The man who had awakened the soul of Rome now faced his greatest torment. Justice demanded sacrifice, and so he gave it. His sons were brought forth in chains, eyes dark with shame or stubbornness. Before the gaze of the people, the same people who had seen him rise as guardian of the Republic, Brutus watched the lictors raise their rods. No tears fell, no cries escaped. Only silence, thick and final, as the sons of the Republic's father were struck down. In that moment, Rome became real. Not a dream, not a cry of vengeance, but a nation of law where even blood could not shield from judgment. Brutus did not rule by sword, he ruled by surrender, surrendering what was most precious so that the flame of liberty might survive. And the people saw it. They did not cheer, they did not weep, they remembered. Through this fire, the Republic was forged not in marble, not in scrolls, but in the agony of choices no man should make. When the Tarquins returned again, it was not with words but with war. The exiled king rallied Etruscan hosts, seeking to reclaim what he had lost not by justice but by birthright. And at the Battle of Silva Arcia, the armies of the Republic met him. There the old world clashed with the new crown against consent, tyranny against oath. Brutus charged into the fray like a storm given flesh. And there, in the chaos of spears and screams, he met his end, his blood sinking into the same earth he had given everything to free. But death could not unmake him. His fall became a monument, his silence a commandment. The body of Brutus was carried back to Rome with no trumpet, no triumph, only solemnity. A statue was raised, not of a king, not of a god, but of a citizen. Rome had killed her kings, and in their place she had birthed something even more dangerous: a republic. The streets did not forget. The stones held the memory of those first cries, those first deaths, those first fires. And though the shadows of monarchy had fled, they waited just beyond the veil of time, for freedom is not the end of struggle. It is the beginning, and Rome had only just begun to learn what liberty would demand. The crown was cast into the dust, shattered not by sword but by the will of the people, and in its place rose the echo of a new order. Where once stood a throne, now stood a chamber. The Senate, cloaked in tradition and illusion, claimed the sacred duty of governance. Beneath vaulted ceilings, where light filtered through colonnades in quiet reverence, the voices of old families stirred, proud, calculating, and hungry. They did not wear purple, they bore no laurel crowns, but they held the same fever that once throbbed in the temples of kings. Beneath the togas and the solemnity of law, old ambitions pulsed like blood beneath pale skin. Liberty had unshackled the city, but it had not cleansed the hearts of men. The Republic had no monarch, but it had men who dreamed of becoming more than citizens. They did not speak of power. They cloaked it in virtue, in senatus consultum, in the language of preservation. Yet in the silence behind their words, old patterns re-emerged: ambition cloaked in duty, rivalry disguised as patriotism, vengeance stitched into procedure. In the Curia, shadows lengthened not with the passage of the sun, but with the growing presence of factions. The patricians, descendants of Rome's ancient lines, viewed themselves as guardians of the sacred flame. Their names, weathered like inscriptions on stone, held weight: Fabii, Cornelii, Claudii, families who believed Rome's bloodline ran through their veins alone. Opposite them stood the plebeians, sons of merchants, soldiers, and craftsmen, the pulse of the city. They had bled in the wars, labored in the fields, and suffered under kings. Now, in this brittle republic, they demanded a voice. Their champions, tribunes of the people, did not kneel before tradition. They rose again and again to challenge the cold nobility of the Senate. But the Senate was not a place of one voice. It was a chorus, dissonant, echoing, and sometimes deadly. Behind every speech lay an intention, behind every vote a ledger, behind every alliance a blade unsheathed. In time, law became a labyrinth, procedure a mask for paralysis. The consuls, chosen each year to rule jointly, found themselves caught in the web of senatorial intrigue. One man sought military glory, the other financial control. Their unity meant to check tyranny, too often unraveled into rivalry. And the people, those who had lifted their voices to crush the Tarquins, began to see the iron of kings replaced by the velvet of politics, softer but no less binding. In the Forum, where voices once rose in righteous fury, now rose the murmurs of compromise and disappointment. Grain shortages, debt bondage, conscription, these plagued the lower orders. And though the Senate heard their cries, it answered in debates that lasted days, decisions delayed by decorum, and reforms choked by amendments. Justice, once bought with blood, now found itself traded for favors. Some saw this and despaired. Others, however, saw opportunity. New men rose, men without ancient lineage, but with sharper minds and deeper cunning. They learned to navigate the Senate like a battlefield, not with a spear or sword, but with rhetoric and gold. They befriended generals, whispered in assemblies, and courted the mob. The Republic gave them its tools, and they forged keys not to unlock freedom but to open gates of influence. Behind closed doors, wealth began to dictate policy. Patrons acquired clients, debts bought loyalty, and favors became currency more valuable than coins. The Republic had laws, intricate, revered, but law was parchment, and parchment could burn. Even the tribunes, once guardians of the people's dignity, became susceptible. Some were brave, incorruptible, others seduced by proximity to power. The balance, always delicate, began to tilt. And still beyond the Tiber's bend and Rome's golden hills, enemies watched. They saw a city divided, strong, yes, but distracted. The Etruscans to the north, the Samnites to the east, and Carthage, mighty and patient, across the sea. Rome's victories abroad would soon demand leaders of iron, and iron has no patience for deliberation. Within the Senate's sacred chamber, the seeds were planted of greatness and of ruin. The men who stood beneath its arches believed they were building a legacy, preserving the flame of liberty. But in truth, they were forging a paradox, a republic where no king ruled, yet many vied for a crown in all but name. Outside, the people still gathered in the Forum, beneath the sky that once bore witness to tyranny's fall. They looked upon the rostra, upon the curving steps, upon the marble statues of gods and heroes, and wondered, was this what they had bled for? The Republic breathed but shallowly. It lived but in tension. Its soul, noble in vision, now wrestled with the weight of its own complexity. The kings were gone, but the hunger to rule had never left. It had merely changed its face. And the shadows behind the Senate, they waited, they grew, not as ghosts of monarchy, but as omens of a power not yet understood. In time, these shadows would find form. And when they did, Rome would tremble again. Beneath the bronze whisper of the Capitoline wind, Rome was not only rising, it was unraveling. Its borders stretched with the thunder of conquest. Its legions thundered across Gaul and Greece. And yet beneath the triumphal arches and colonnades, a deeper battle simmered, one not fought with steel, but with grain and parchment, hunger and silence. In the slums of the Aventine and the wind-bitten farms of Latium, veterans returned from war to find their land claimed, their homes dissolved into patrician estates. Men who had fought for Rome's glory now wandered its streets with hollow eyes and calloused hands. The Republic had conquered the world, but it had forgotten its sons. It was into this silence that he stepped, not a soldier, not a king, but a man born of ancient name and uncommon conscience. Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, son of a consul, heir to prestige, and yet restless within the opulence of his blood. He had seen the desolation with his own eyes, veterans sleeping in doorways, children clutching bread like treasure, widows begging before temples built with the spoils of empire. He did not come to flatter the Senate, nor to charm the plebs with empty oratory. He came with something more dangerous, a vision. The land of Italy, once held by many, had become the possession of the few. Vast estates sprawled where small farms had stood, their laborers slaves brought from foreign wars. The old Roman yeoman, the backbone of the legions, had withered into memory, and with him Gracchus believed would fall the Republic itself. He stood beneath the sun-drenched sky of the Forum, the people pressed tight around him like sea against rock. His voice was not loud, but it carried with the weight of justice, unbending, sincere. He did not cry for vengeance. He asked only for restoration. Let the land be returned, he said. Let the law be honored. Let Rome remember the hands that built her. The reaction was swift and cold. In the Senate, marble faces turned to stone. These were not men easily moved. They were stewards of tradition, guardians of wealth. They saw in Gracchus not a reformer but a firebrand, a man willing to stir the mob to bypass senatorial consent, to threaten the sacred balance of patrician power. He was elected tribune of the plebs, a position with the power to protect the people and to provoke the wrath of the elite. With pen and principle, he revived the agrarian laws long buried by dust and disuse. Land seized illegally by the rich would be reclaimed and redistributed. No citizen was to hold more than the law allowed. In parchment, it was justice, but in the halls of the Senate, it was treason. When opposition rose, Tiberius did not bend. He removed the obstructing tribune from office, an act legal but unprecedented. And so the rules that had once shielded the Republic were now shaken by the man who sought to save it. To the masses, he was a savior. To the nobles, a storm. Whispers of monarchy began to stir not because he claimed a crown, but because he dared to stand alone. As he moved through the city, he was followed not by guards, but by throngs of supporters, carpenters, veterans, farmers. They carried no weapons, only hope. And hope in Rome was a dangerous thing. He stood for re-election, again legal but inflammatory. The Senate watched with growing dread. They saw not a man but a precedent, and they feared what would follow if this challenge went unanswered. The day of the vote, the forum was thick with tension. The Senate met in the Temple of Fides, overlooking the teeming square. And there, in the name of order, they chose violence. A mob of senators, led by Scipio Nasica, wrapped their togas around their arms, gripped wooden staves and broken chair legs, and marched upon the forum like wolves descending from the Palatine. There was no trial, no speech, no warning. Tiberius, surrounded by his followers, raised his hand not in threat but in signal, a gesture misread, a movement condemned. They fell upon him in the shadow of Capitoline Hill. Blow after blow rained down, not in the battlefield's chaos, but in cold, deliberate silence. Blood pooled where laws had once been debated. A man who had served Rome with valor now lay broken upon its sacred stones, his body cast into the Tiber like refuse, denied even the rites of burial. The wolves had entered the forum, and they would not leave, but something had changed, something ancient had awakened. For the Republic had not just slain a man, it had struck at its own soul, and the echo of that moment would carry through marble halls and blood-stained scrolls for years to come. And the people, they remembered. The sun rose that morning as it always had, golden, indifferent, eternal pouring light across the marble bones of Rome. But beneath that still and ancient sky, the Republic held its breath. The Forum, once a place of debate and law, now pulsed with unspoken dread. Something sacred was about to shatter. Tiberius Gracchus, tribune of the plebs, stood at the edge of fate, not with a sword drawn or an army at his back, but with a scroll in his hand and a nation in his eyes. His tunic, though simple, bore the invisible weight of all he had dared to speak for the dispossessed, to challenge the untouchable, to bend law into justice. The people gathered below, swarming the steps like a tide held in place by invisible force. They came with empty stomachs and full hearts, called not by banners, but by the voice that had once echoed their sorrow to the stone ears of the Senate. They came for him, the man who had dared to remember them. But across the forum, another gathering stirred. Senators, robed in white but steeped in fear, watched from the temple of Jupiter. Their eyes held not the fire of patriotism, but the cold dread of precedent, for they had seen what Gracchus could do. With one law, he had threatened their estates. With one gesture, he had defied their order. With one word, he had roused the mob, and now he sought re-election. It was lawful, but to them it was heresy. A tribune re-elected was a tribune permanent. A permanent tribune was a monarch in disguise. They saw in him the glint of crownless kingship, and they saw in themselves a fatting flame. The rumors festered, that he would seize the capital, that he plotted tyranny, that he would return Rome to the days of Tarquin, cloaked in popular love. And so they resolved, if Rome was to be saved, he must fall not with dignity but with finality. Nasica, pontifex and kinsman to Scipio Africanus, rose in rage disguised as piety. He called on the Senate to act not in law but in blood, and they answered. They did not wear armor, they carried no gladii. They wrapped their arms in their togas and took up the legs of benches, the fragments of chairs, the relics of ceremony turned into crude weapons. Like a procession of wolves, they descended from the temple into the sea of citizens. The people parted uncertain, unsure. The Senate had never come like this before. Tiberius stood upon the rostra, raising his hand, perhaps to calm, perhaps to signal, perhaps to shield. We will never know. For in that gesture Nasica saw treason. The first blow fell like thunder, then another, then many. The crowd screamed not in rebellion but in horror. This was no battle, it was an execution. The tribune fell, not with sword in hand, but with broken ribs and torn flesh, his blood watering the sacred stones where laws had once been born. He did not die for the empire. He did not die in conquest. He died for asking Rome to keep its promises. No trial, no funeral, no tomb. His body, mangled and stripped of dignity, was cast into the Tiber as though it had never mattered. But rivers remember. And so do people. The silence that followed was not peace, it was ruptured. The Republic had spilled the blood of one of its own, not on foreign soil, but in the heart of its sanctum. A tribune had been murdered in daylight by those sworn to uphold the very system he died defending. The precedent was set not of law, but of fear. That when the words of one man grew too sharp, they could be bludgeoned. That when the people found a voice, it could be drowned. That power, when threatened, would trade robes for clubs without hesitation. The wolves had shown their teeth, and the forum would never be the same. And yet, in dark corners of the city, among the grieving poor and the disillusioned young, whispers began to stir, of injustice, of martyrdom, of a Rome that had slain its future to protect its past. For death is not always an ending. Sometimes it is a kindling. And beneath the dust where Tiberius Gracchus fell, something ancient began to smolder. There was a time when the Roman soldier was a farmer first, a man of the land, drawn from field to battlefield by duty, only to return to the soil when the war was done. He bore arms for the Republic, not for riches or fame, but because Rome called and he could not refuse her. Yet time does not stand still, and neither does the empire. Conquest stretches the bones of nations, and the old ways, noble though they be, are devoured by necessity. From the dust of Numidia and the blood-soaked plains of the Cimbrian north, a new figure emerged, broad of shoulder, iron in gaze, forged not in aristocratic birth, but in the furnace of ambition and battlefield command. Gaius Marius. His name was not ancient, but it would become immortal. He came not from the patricians, but from the plebs, the rough earth of Arpinum rather than the marbled lineage of Rome. Yet he rose step by step through valor, cunning, and an unshakable will. He saw what others could not, that the old army, bound by property requirements and tradition, was no longer fit for the world Rome now ruled. The frontiers were vast. The enemies are relentless. The landless poor, teeming in Rome's streets, were idle and desperate. Marius, ever the pragmatist, saw a single solution to many problems. He opened the legions to the Capite censi, the headcount men who own nothing but their breath and their hunger. No farms, no wealth, only muscle, fire, and a desire to rise. For them, military service was not duty, it was deliverance. With Senate resistance silenced by crisis, Marius reshaped the heart of Rome. Standards were raised, equipment standardized, cohesion replaced chaos. And the eagle, Rome's sacred symbol, now flew at the head of every legion, not merely as a sign of the Republic, but as the soul of the unit. The legions became a brotherhood bound not by city or senate, but by loyalty to the man who forged them. And in doing so, Marius changed Rome forever. For these men did not fight for the abstract glory of the state. They fought for the general who had given them armor, identity, and purpose. Their allegiance was no longer to the law, but to the hand that led them into victory. With every campaign, every triumph, every coin of plunder, Marius grew more than victorious. He became adored. The victories came swift and brutal. The Jugurthan War ended not with negotiation, but with seizure. The Germanic threat from the north, the Cimbrian Teutons, towering and unrelenting, was broken beneath Marius's command. At Aquae Sextiae, he unleashed his legions like wolves, and the ground ran thick with the blood of giants. Rome had faced annihilation. Marius offered her salvation. The people crowned him in adulation. 6 times he was made consul, a record untouched by precedent, by caution, by fear of monarchy. He was no king, but he was no longer merely a citizen. The Republic had made a sword, and in doing so, it had given that sword a will of its own. Yet in the cool marble chambers of the Senate, unease thickened like storm clouds. They saw what was happening. The legions, once an extension of the Republic, were now loyal to a man. The balance of Rome had shifted. Power no longer flowed only from the curia and the laws of tradition, but from the camps, from the standards carried on the backs of bloodied men who did not speak Cicero's Latin or care for senatorial debate. They loved Marius, and Marius loved war. And war is a creature that, once fed, demands more. The line between soldier and citizen blurred. Generals began to wield the threat of their own legions as levers of politics. To oppose a man like Marius was no longer just disagreement, it was a risk. For now, men ruled with the knowledge that steel, not law, might be the final arbiter. But Marius, too, was mortal. Age slowed his gait. Politics twisted the air around him. Once hailed as savior, he grew paranoid, restless, hungering for recognition he felt slipping from his grasp. His rivalry with Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a younger general of patrician stock, darkened into vendetta. The old lion and the rising serpent coiled around the same ambition: Rome's future. When Marius died, his body was interred with honors, but his legacy did not rest. He had given the Republic a gift veiled as a curse. The military machine he built did not die with him. It lived on in the loyalty of legions to generals, in the thunder of boots across foreign lands, in the soft collapse of senatorial authority. What he had crafted in necessity would become the model for Caesar, for Pompey, for all who would rise not through law but through legions. Rome had armored itself, and in doing so had forged the very engines of its undoing. The Republic had not yet fallen, but the sound of marching feet had begun to drown out the voice of the Forum. And the road that Marius paved, with triumphs and reforms and noble cause, would one day carry a dictator toward a crown forged not of gold but of iron. Night in northern Italy came cold and quick, falling like a black shroud across the restless camps and trembling trees. The moon, pale and pitiless, hung above the river Rubicon, casting silver over its shallow waters. It was not a mighty stream. No chasm yawned there, no thunderous current roared. It was narrow, humble, easily forded. But what it separated was not land, but history. One side was the province of Cisalpine Gaul, the realm of a general, a soldier of the state. The other side was Italy proper, the sacred heart of the Republic, and by law to enter it with armed legions was to declare war upon Rome itself. The river whispered with ancient consequence. Around its banks the oaks creaked in the darkness, as if aware of the gravity poised to unfold. And there at its edge stood a man wrapped in cloak and silence. His gaze was not on the water, but beyond it, beyond the veil of legality, beyond the illusions of peace. Gaius Julius Caesar. He was not yet emperor, he was not yet dictator. He was a general, a politician, a man of immense charm and devastating ambition. And yet in his silence there was already a shadow, something vast, something ancient stirring in the marrow of Rome. He knew the law. He knew that to cross with legionary standards was to tear the veil, to unmake the pact between arms and civility. But he also knew something greater, that the Republic as it stood was a ghost clothed in marble. It had long ago ceased to represent the will of the many. In its halls, old men clung to power like vultures to a corpse. The Senate had become a theater of delay, a monument to a world unwilling to see itself undone. Behind him stood the 13th Legion, veterans of Gaul, hardened by a decade of conquest, stained by the blood of a million. They did not cheer, they did not question. They waited, blades at their sides, breath in their chests. Their loyalty was not to Rome's decrees, but to the man who had led them from the icy forests of the north to the edge of eternity. A messenger had already been sent, a final plea, a final chance. But the Senate, steered by Pompey and the Optimates, had not answered with compromise. They had ordered him to disband, to return alone, to face judgment as a criminal. It was a sentence delivered by men who feared him more than they feared war. And so he stood on the bank, cloaked in decision, and whispered a phrase remembered long after the Republic itself had vanished. Alia iacta est. The die is cast. His horse stepped forward, hooves breaking the mirrored surface. Soldiers followed, iron glinting beneath the stars. Across that shallow water rode a truth that would shatter an age, a truth wrapped in flesh, in fame, in fire. The Rubicon did not weep, the night did not howl, but the world changed. In the distance, the cities of Italy began to tremble, governors fled, towns closed their gates, then opened them again in surrender. Roman citizens watched the red cloaks of the 13th Legion move like blood through the land. They did not resist, they remembered. They remembered the triumphs. They remembered Gaul. They remembered Caesar. Pompey, once his ally, now his rival, had expected resistance to stiffen around him, for the Senate's authority to inspire loyalty. But instead it scattered. Rome's heart had grown weary of oligarchs who ruled through tradition rather than merit, who scorned the people while enriching themselves. They saw in Caesar something terrifying and magnetic, a man who could speak to them not as plebeians, but as Rome itself. And Caesar, ever the master of theater and timing, knew the value of mercy. He did not punish cities that surrendered. He issued no mass retributions. His war, he claimed, was not with the people, but with a corrupt Senate that had betrayed them all. In this there was genius and there was poison. As his forces approached the capital, Pompey fled not to fight but to regroup. Southward he moved across the sea to Greece, gathering legions from the east. It was not yet over, not yet decided. The civil war had begun not in fire but in a footstep. But its end would come in fire enough. In the days that followed, Caesar entered Rome unopposed. No king, no laurel crown, and yet the silence that greeted him was not that of peace. It was the hush before the storm. For the Republic, already trembling beneath the weight of its contradictions, had now been given a reckoning in the shape of a man. A man with no patience for compromise, no tolerance for delay, no intention of becoming a name carved into forgotten scrolls. He had crossed the river, and now the world would follow. The ashes of Pharsalus still drifted on the wind, thin as mist, soft as memory. Upon that haunted plain in Thessaly, the last true army of the Republic had broken like a wave upon the stone of Caesar's will. Legion turned against legion, Roman blood spilled by Rome in hand, the gods watching, silent as ever, from their high thrones of indifference. Pompey the Great, once master of the East, hero of 100 triumphs, fled not as a general but as a hunted man. Across sea and desert he ran, seeking refuge in the kingdom of Egypt, where he had once placed kings like pieces on a board. But fate has no loyalty, and memory grows short in the heat of power. At Pelusium's shore he was greeted not by sanctuary, but by betrayal, assassins sent by those who thought Caesar would be pleased. His head, severed and salt-stained, was offered like a prize to the man who had once called him son-in-law. But Caesar, upon receiving it, did not smile. He turned away in silence, cloaking his grief in ceremony, for even amid victory there are lines that power must not cross. And though the Senate had named Pompey enemy of the state, he was Roman, he was legacy, he was a ghost that deserved more than a butcher's end. Yet in that moment the world understood Caesar had no equals now, only shadows. From Egypt's burning sands, Caesar emerged not merely as general, but as architect of destiny. He lingered in Alexandria longer than strategy required. There, amid the golden stones and perfumed halls of the Ptolemaic court, he met Cleopatra, queen by birth, ruler by wit, survivor by necessity. In her, Caesar found something familiar, the fire of ambition veiled in grace. Together they carved a fleeting empire of silk and storm. The Nile whispered through moonlit chambers as their names were stitched together in myth. A child was born, Caesarion, a name that trembled with dangerous prophecy, but Rome called and Caesar answered. He returned not to seek vengeance, but to offer clemency, to pardon his enemies, to declare amnesty, to heal the wounds his sword had opened. But beneath this olive branch the blade remained sharp, unwavering, clean. The Senate, though hollowed, still breathed. It met in ceremony, it whispered in corners, but it knew. It knew that Caesar was no longer a consul, no longer merely a general. He was something else, something elemental, a man who walked with the weight of fate at his heels and the silence of gods on his shoulders. They gave him titles, hopping to tame him with laurels. Dictator for 10 years, then dictator for life. Honors that once would have shaken the stones of the Republic now fell from their mouths like prayers to a rising sun. He wore no crown of gold. But the laurel wreath upon his brow gleamed with finality. It was the garland of triumph, of imperium absolute. And around him the machinery of the state bent like iron warmed in fire. Laws were reformed, calendars corrected, debt forgiven, colonies founded in the names of the fallen. He did not destroy the Republic. He preserved its image while hollowing it from within. The people adored him. They saw in him not a tyrant, but a redeemer, the man who fed them, protected them, restored their pride. In the forum his statue stood beside the kings of old, and the plebs did not flinch. They cheered, for Rome, so long torn by faction and famine, had found something more intoxicating than liberty. Order, peace. And yet beneath the marble and pageantry tremors stirred. For the old ways, though bloodied, though broken, remembered themselves. In the Senate, men with ancient names and brittle pride watched the rise of Caesar not as deliverance, but as damnation. He sat alone in the curule chair. He spoke, and laws bent. He breathed, and Rome moved. The Senate still gathered, but its voice had softened. It was no longer a lion, it was echo. And still Caesar pushed forward. Temples were built in his name. His image was minted upon a coin. He accepted honors once reserved for the divine. In the minds of many, he was already more than man. The boundary between mortal and myth blurred like ink in water, but power once seized does not rest. In the month of Quintilis, renamed Julius, he held games. Lavish, thunderous, God-touched. The people chanted his name with reverence. But in the shadows of the basilicas, whispers grew of kingship, of destiny, of a crown offered and perhaps one day accepted. For Rome had always hated kings. And in the eyes of some, Caesar, draped in purple, crowned in laurel, seated upon a golden throne, had become one in all but name. The man who had crossed the Rubicon in defiance of tyranny now stood accused of becoming what he had overthrown. He offered peace. He offered restoration. But what he built was something new, an empire disguised in the skin of a republic. And the men of the old world, the guardians of the senatorial flame, began to ask themselves a question that would echo through history. If Rome was to remain free, must Caesar die? The morning broke soft and golden on the streets of Rome, as though the heavens themselves hesitated to unveil the final hour of an age. A thin mist curled along the Tiber, veiling the city in a hush, as if the very stones held their breath. Beneath the palatial heights, the marble temples and bustling forums of the eternal city gleamed with deceptive calm, unaware or unwilling to admit that today would taste of iron and finality. In the theater of Pompey, just off the field of Mars, the Senate gathered beneath vaulted stone and sacred duty. But there was no thunder of debate this morning, no wrangling of law or motion. There was only waiting, a silence laced with dread and resolve. Cloaks rustled. Eyes avoided each other, hands fidgeted beneath folds of white, for today the Senate would not legislate. Today the Senate would kill. And at the center of this stillness was a name that had become more than a man, Caesar. He came without fear, without guard, without doubt. Draped in the imperial purple, crowned in laurel, he walked not as a general nor a consul, but as something the world had not yet fully named. The people loved him, the army would die for him, the world bowed to him. Only the Senate stood trembling in his shadow, not because of what he had done, but because of what he might yet become. He entered the hall like an omen. Some rose in greeting, others bowed their heads. But the blades were already hidden beneath the robes, the steel trembling like the hearts that held it. Among them stood Brutus, descendant of the ancient liberator, bearer of a name heavy with legacy. He had once fought at Caesar's side and had once called him friend. And yet now he bore the weight of prophecy, the belief that to save the Republic, he must strike down the man who had become its god. Caesar took his seat. It was then, as the sun shifted high above the oculus of the theater, that they closed in. Casca struck first, clumsy and unsure. A scratch more than a wound. Caesar turned, confusion in his eyes, then pain. More followed, metal flashing from all directions, the circle tightening. Each senator, bound by conspiracy and terror, struck wildly. Blood spattered across the floor, across marble, across law itself. The cries of the great man echoed beneath the stone, but no help came. No soldier rushed forward. No loyal voice broke through. The pact had been sealed too tightly. Then Brutus stepped forward, and Caesar saw him. At that moment time slowed. The Forum, the Republic, the conquests, the triumphs, the dreams, all of it blurred behind the face of one man, a friend, a son in spirit, the wound that would matter most. Et tu, Brute, the words were not shouted. They whispered, a gasp, a letting go, and then silence. The body collapsed, robes soaked in red, falling at the foot of Pompey's statue, the man Caesar had defeated, the ghost he had eclipsed. There he lay, slumped beneath marble memory, a conqueror unmourned. No triumph, no final command, only blood. The senators fled into the streets, breathless, wide-eyed, as though the act had severed not just a man, but the world itself. Rome did not rejoice. It did not erupt in celebration. It trembled. For though Caesar was dead, his shadow did not vanish, it grew. The Ides of March were not the end, they were the turning of the knife. A god had bled, a tyrant had fallen, but in that sacred betrayal, something greater than one life was torn. For the republic they swore to protect would not rise again. The people would not rally behind parchment and tradition. They would grieve, they would rage. They would remember the bread, the games, the glory, and they would seek not liberty but vengeance. The Senate had slain the body, but they had birthed a martyr. And in that silent theater, beneath the watchful eyes of marble kings and crumbling law, Rome stepped into a new darkness, one where no man would ever again walk unchallenged, yet none would dare to rise without a crown. The sky over Rome hung heavy with the weight of mourning, darkened not by cloud or storm, but by the breathless silence of a city whose soul had been severed. The streets, once echoing with the cadence of commerce and command, now bristled with uneasy stillness. No herald sang, no orators debated. A pall had fallen across the Forum, and the eternal city, proud, unyielding, impervious to kings, trembled like a child in the grip of something it could not name. Caesar was dead, and yet Rome did not feel free. It felt abandoned. His body, shrouded and broken, was carried through the winding arteries of the city on a bier of cedar and mourning. The wound-stained robes he once wore lay folded beside him, pierced through with the daggers of friends and patriots, or so they had claimed. The scent of incense hung thick in the air, but beneath it one could still catch the iron tang of blood. Children wept beside mothers. Veterans stood still as statues. Even the wind moved slowly, as if it too bowed to grief. In the Forum, where Caesar's voice had once thundered and his will had shaped the fate of nations, a platform rose, and upon it stood Mark Antony. He was not dressed for war, though war simmered in his eyes. His cloak was not the purple of emperors, nor the white of priests. It was a robe dark as ash, heavy with sorrow and resolve. Beside him stood the image of the dead man, not carved in stone, but real, waxen, cruel in its mimicry. It bore the scars, the wounds, the twisted expression of betrayal. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some cheered when the tyrant fell. Others had whispered prayers. But all had come, drawn by the pull of something ancient, not politics, not loyalty, but the raw gravity of death. Antony did not shout. His voice came low, like a tide beginning its rise. He spoke of Caesar's love, not of glory or conquest, but of the people. He named the triumphs not written in marble, but carved into the lives of Rome's hungry, its veterans, its builders. He read aloud the will: land to the poor, gold to every citizen. The gift of a king from a man who had refused a crown. And then he turned. He raised the robe. The holes were not few, the blood was not dry. He did not describe the wounds with flourish. He pointed. One by one, this, he said, was Brutus, this Casca, here Decimus. And as he spoke, the crowd shifted again, no longer in sorrow, but in fury. They had come to bury a man, now they looked upon a martyr. A voice rose from the back, a curse. Another, a shout, a third, a scream, and then the dam broke. They surged forward, not toward the conspirators, but toward the pyre. Hands tore down benches, split doors from hinges, ripped roof beams from temples. Wood piled in the forum like a funeral storm. Flames were struck, and Rome watched its own grief ignite. The fire rose high, devouring not just the body, but the illusions of peace. The crowd howled not with grief alone, but with the ancient cry of vengeance. The Senate fled, the conspirators scattered, their triumph turned to terror. Statues were toppled, houses burned. In the streets, chaos danced with purpose. The Republic had slain its master, and now it must face the wrath of his shadow. Mark Antony stood above the blaze, no longer a friend in mourning, but a man crowned by fire and fury. He had not declared war. He had not raised a sword, but with words alone he had lit a funeral that would burn the world. The ashes would not settle for years to come. But already in those embers, new names began to stir, names whispered not in mourning, but in prophecy. One of them was Octavian, another vengeance, another still empire. And Rome, veiled in smoke and echo, would never be the same again. The storm did not break all at once. It gathered first, slow, deliberate, suffocating. In the aftermath of Caesar's pyre, as the scent of ash still clung to the stones of the Forum, Rome stood on the edge of something older than war, a reckoning born not from conquest, but from betrayal, grief, and fear carved into vengeance. Out of the chaos, three men emerged, strange allies bound not by trust, but by necessity. Marcus Antonius, veiled in the flame-lit glory of Caesar's last rites. Gaius Lepidus, quiet and cautious, holding the loyalty of legions like a coin not yet spent. And then Octavian, the youth, the heir, the shadow made flesh. Barely more than a boy, but in his gaze gleamed the cold machinery of the unborn empire. Together they raised what had not been seen since the days of Sulla, a triumvirate. Not by law, not by consent, but by force of arms and the weight of names now written in fire. Three men who claimed to restore order, yet carried in their wake the thunder of death. The Republic, such as it was, had no shield left. The Senate had become a whisper. The people, wounded, divided, watched with hollow eyes as something sacred was transfigured. For the triumvirs did not come to govern, they came to cleanse, and so came the lists. Written in ink and blood, nailed to walls, read aloud in forums once filled with laughter and law. Proscriptions, a word now soaked in terror. Names etched on parchment, names whispered in fear, names hunted in alleys and vineyards and countryside estates. Men who had once debated policy, drafted legislation, broken bread in the curia, now ran through shadows like beasts pursued. Their estates seized, their sons marked, their wives were stripped of honor. A republic of laws had become a marketplace of execution, where death was currency and silence the price of survival. And at the center of this maelstrom stood one name, spoken not with hatred but with reverence, a name whose eloquence had once turned war into pause, whose pen had once shaped the soul of Rome. Cicero. Marcus Tullius Cicero, philosopher, orator, statesman, had been many things: a defender of the Republic, a scorner of Caesar, a reluctant ally of Octavian, and finally a man betrayed not by his enemies but by the shifting sands of ambition. He had believed in the boy. Believed Octavian would resist Antony's rise. Believed virtue could still steer the storm. But virtue in those days had no armor. His name appeared on the list. He fled not to stir rebellion, but to die with dignity. Along the coast, in the quiet stillness of a villa by the sea, he waited not for mercy, but for the hand he knew would come. When the assassins arrived, he did not cower. He offered his throat, the very vessel of the voice that had once commanded the Senate's soul. They cut it. And with it they took his hands, the hands that had written the speeches, the letters, the warnings. A message was carved into silence. The voice of the Republic had been extinguished, not in debate, but in blood. Rome did not speak. Rome burned, no tomb was raised, no statue unveiled, but the earth remembered, and in time so would the world. Across the provinces the purge continued. Gold flowed into the coffers of the triumvirs. Death flowed through the veins of the Republic. The proscriptions were not justice. They were arithmetic, enemies removed. Wealth seized, power consolidated, and yet beneath this iron order nothing was healed. The cracks were widening. The alliance that bound Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian was forged of need, not trust. They watched each other even as they hunted others. The ghosts of the murdered began to gather. And in the smoke, in the silence, the question remained, had the Republic died with Caesar, or had it perished long before and only now did the fire reveal its corpse? The answer waited, in battlefields yet unbloodied, in betrayals yet imagined, in the eyes of a boy who would become Augustus. But in that moment, as Cicero's severed hands were nailed to the very rostra where he once moved hearts like tides, the future held its breath. And vengeance ruled. The Nile flowed like a silver thread through the sands of legend, winding through the bones of ancient gods and kingdoms long buried. Its waters knew no Rome, no Senate, no Caesar. They whispered of older empires, of pharaohs and sun gods, of secrets carried on the wings of ibis and the slow breath of the desert. And in that sacred land of lotus and sun, love bloomed like a flame in the shadow of the world's greatest storm. She was not a queen by chance. Cleopatra, daughter of Ptolemy, ruler of Egypt by cunning, courage, and seduction, moved like a priestess and struck like a serpent. Her beauty was not merely of form, it was in her mind, her voice, her command of silence. She wore kingdoms like ornaments and spoke to power as an equal. And into her orbit came a man of unmatched appetite for glory, for wine, for laughter, for war. Mark Antony, Lion of the East, warrior and orator, blood-bound to Caesar, now unmoored in the wake of his death. He had followed vengeance into the heart of the Republic's corpse. He had slaughtered its enemies. He had risen beside Octavian as a god of retribution. But power shared is power threatened, and the world was not wide enough for two sons. He came to Egypt not merely as emissary, but as a man chasing myth. And there, in the shimmering heat of Alexandria, he found it. Their meeting was not an alliance, it was an alchemy. She arrived on a barge of gold and purple, sails billowed with perfume, attendants dressed as cupids, as if to mock the very heavens. Antony laughed not with derision but with awe. He had conquered nations, but he had never seen a woman command the air itself. Their love was not delicate, it was fire and feast, silk and storm. They drank together, ruled together, dreamed together. She bore him children, twins, the union of Rome and Egypt. To her he gave more than his heart. He gave provinces, armies, and pieces of the empire. And to him she offered not just beauty, but a throne beside her, a future where East would not kneel to West. In Alexandria's halls they lived as gods reborn, Dionysus and Isis, Caesar and Cleopatra. But in Rome shadows stirred. Octavian watched from afar, his patience like a blade sharpened in silence. He knew Antony well, his passions, his weaknesses, his need for spectacle. And he knew the people of Rome, their fear of foreign queens, their hatred of kings in Eastern silk. He turned that love into a weapon. Propaganda swept through the city like ash on wind. They said Antony had forsaken Rome for Egypt, had promised the empire's wealth to foreign hands, had bent the knee not to Jupiter but to a temptress who whispered in foreign tongues. They showed coins with foreign names, treaties sealed in bedrooms, children crowned with titles never earned. Octavian did not need to shout, he let the whispers grow, he let the Senate stir, he let Rome hunger for a new savior. And when the moment came, he struck, not with surprise but with inevitability. War was declared not against Antony alone but against Cleopatra, the foreign queen, the enchantress, the shadow behind the throne. Octavian did not march against his fellow Roman but against the East, against indulgence, against memory. The die had been cast once before at the Rubicon. Now it would be thrown again into the sea. Antony, drawn from his dream, woke to find the world sharpened. His legions, once loyal, began to waver. The Senate turned its back. And Rome, ever hungry for drama disguised as destiny, looked to the horizon not for compromise but for a final reckoning. The lovers would not flee, they would not yield. In Egypt, in the land where gods once walked, they prepared to meet their fate not as victims, but as rulers daring to stand against the tide. But even the Nile could not turn back to the sea. And Octavian, with patience now transformed into thunder, moved westward, with legions behind him and destiny in his hands. He came not as a man seeking vengeance, but as one prepared to write the ending himself. For Rome, he believed, had room for only one Caesar, and history would choose. The sea stretched silent and blue beneath the Greek sun, its waters vast and indifferent, a mirror to the heavens, untroubled by the ambitions of men. But at Actium, in that narrow throat of ocean between land and fate, The tides would be stirred not by wind or moon, but by the wrath of empires converging. Here destiny gathered beneath banners of silk and iron. On one shore stood Octavian, the adopted son of Caesar, his legions hardened by discipline and belief, his ships sleek, maneuverable, eager. Beside him, the ghost of the Republic breathed one final prayer, a dying illusion he was careful never to profane, even as he prepared to end it. Opposite him, drawn across the waters like a dream forged in gold, stood the fleet of Antony and Cleopatra, a marriage of Rome's fire and Egypt's grace. Their ships, larger, more ornate, bristling with towers and gilded prows, gleamed in the morning light like the myths of old. But myths do not always endure the iron weight of reality. Antony's war had become a war of love and legacy, his fate entwined with Cleopatra's crown. She was no longer merely consort or queen, she was co-commander, a sovereign soul beside him on the deck of a world that would not bow. And he, the Lion of Rome, had staked everything, his name, his power, his life, on a final victory. But love does not build navies. Loyalty does not guarantee discipline. And Antony, once the scourge of Caesar's enemies, now led an alliance fraying at its seams. On the morning of battle, September's air hung tense and dry. The oars dipped, rose, and fell in perfect rhythm. Trumpets sounded not in triumph, but in warning. Two worlds faced each other, drawn by war, compelled by fate. The ships collided like beasts, ramming, boarding, burning. Javelins pierced the sky. Fire leapt from deck to sail. The sea itself darkened with ash, with tar, with blood. Antony fought not as a general removed from the fray, but as a man desperate to seize a future slipping through his fingers. He commanded with fury, with courage, with desperation. And yet it was not courage that determined Actium. It was ordered calculation. The slow, grinding advance of a vision cold as marble. Octavian's admiral Agrippa, brilliant, relentless, turned the tide with maneuver and patience. Smaller ships outflanked the monstrous galleys of the east. Fire ships pierced the ranks. The great floating fortresses that Antony had trusted became cages, easy prey to the fast and ruthless. And then the moment that broke history. Cleopatra, aboard her own vessel, sensing doom's approach, turned her sails to the wind. Her fleet withdrew, some say too early, some say by plan. Perhaps a signal, perhaps a betrayal, none can say. Antony saw her leave, and in that instant he followed. He abandoned the battle. The lion, the soldier, the prince of Rome, fled the field for the woman whose eyes had once held a crown. His fleet, disoriented, broken, lighterless, collapsed beneath the sea and fire. The cries of dying men echoed across the straits, mixing with the crash of hulls and the hiss of flame. The sea, unshaken by the empire's fall, lapped at the wreckage with quiet inevitability. Octavian did not celebrate, he watched. Victory had come not in glory, but in attrition. The last rival was broken, the East had bowed. There would be no more consuls, no more factions, no more games of balance and betrayal. He did not need to declare himself king. He had no need for a crown or diadem. The sea had spoken, Rome had listened. In the ashes of Actium, the age of republics died, and from the blood and smoke and silence, a new name prepared to rise, not Octavian, not Caesar's heir, but something more enduring, Augustus. The ashes of Actium still smoldered in the minds of men when Octavian returned to Rome, not as a conqueror to be crowned, but as a son coming home. He entered not beneath arches of triumph, but beneath the weight of centuries, and in his hands he carried not spoils but silence. There were no more enemies, no more legions arrayed against the heart of the empire, no more names left on the lists of war. What remained was Rome, fractured, tired, and yearning for the memory of peace. He did not claim dominion by decree. He offered resignation. He laid down his arms before the Senate and called himself a citizen once more. It was theater, but Rome, wounded and weary, craved the illusion more than truth. And so they gave him power again, willingly, unanimously. He became princeps, first among equals, cloaked in humility. They offered titles like garlands, Augustus, the revered one, Pater Patri, father of the fatherland. Each name is another stone in the altar being built around him. Yet beneath the masks of tradition, a new order rose. He restored the temple's stone sanctuaries of forgotten gods, now vibrant with incense and procession. He rebuilt what war had broken: aqueducts, roads, forums, fountains. The marble of Rome gleamed like never before, wrapped in the promise of eternity. He spoke of peace not as a pause, but as destiny fulfilled. The Pax Romana began not with treaties, but with submission. Dissent did not vanish, it was absorbed, dissolved, softened into obedience. He left the Senate intact, but its voice was hollow. He held no crown, yet all commands flowed through his hands. He wore no armor in the forum, but the legions swore loyalty to him alone. Rome, which had once slaughtered kings, now knelt without protest to a man who had become a myth within his own lifetime. Coins bore his face, calm, composed, eternal. Statues rose not merely in civic squares, but in temples. His name became a hymn spoken in the same breath as Mars and Jupiter. Oaths were sworn not to the Republic, but to his genius, his divine spirit. Children were raised to see his silhouette as the shape of law itself. And Augustus, always measured, always distant, allowed it, not out of vanity, but to ensure that nothing could challenge him. He understood that gods cannot be opposed. He surrounded himself with the trappings of the old, ancient rituals, forgotten priesthoods, republican forms, but none could deny that something deeper had changed. Power no longer lived in the Senate or the vote. It lived in the breath of one man. Even his family became part of the myth. He exiled his own daughter when scandal touched her name. He sculpted heirs from marble and blood only to watch them perish or falter. He outlived them all, his power outlasting affection, even kinship. The city he ruled was no longer the city of Brutus or Cicero or Cato. It was his. He walked through it as a shadow made real, a living emblem, a breathing monument. Every brick laid, every law passed, every poet praised, all circled back to him, orbiting like moons around a hidden sun. And still he insisted he was not a king, but kings could be dethroned. Augustus had become something safer, something more enduring. He had become necessary. And as Rome slept beneath the golden dome of order he had built, no one dared ask what price had been paid or what would happen when he was gone. For the peace he gave was real. And yet beneath its surface it waited, the stillness of the storm's eye. The Tiber flowed slowly and golden beneath the rising sun, its surface quiet as polished bronze, as though Rome itself had exhaled after centuries of blood and upheaval. The city, once a republic built on the sharp edge of debate and defiance, now basked in stillness, not the stillness of peace but of structure. Stone upon stone, law upon law, a rhythm not of liberty but of permanence. It did not come with a coronation. No diadem was placed upon his brow. No thunderous proclamation shattered the forum's air. Instead, it came like dusk over the hills, soft, undeniable, vast. 1,000 gestures, subtle as falling leaves, shaping a world. The Senate still convened, robed in tradition, their words draped in the old language of virtue. But they no longer ruled, they confirmed. They praised me. They remembered what it had been to matter and let that memory suffice. In their presence, Augustus, once Octavian, once Caesar's heir, now more than either, sat not above but beyond. He did not demand obedience, he absorbed it. Titles accumulated like dust on the shoulders of time. Princeps, first citizen, imperator, commander, Augustus, the sacred one. Names not shouted from balconies but inscribed into the bones of the empire. He did not rewrite the laws, he became the law's living spirit. The people adored him. Bread was plentiful, games unceasing. Roads reached across the known world like veins from a single heart. The markets buzzed, the provinces obeyed. In every corner of the empire, statues bore his likeness, serene, ageless, God-touched. But gods are not questioned. And Augustus, in his perfection, allowed no cracks. His legions, though stationed far from the capital, pledged loyalty to him alone. Not to Rome, not to the Senate, to the man, to the voice, to the face engraved on the coin and altar. The standards they carried bore eagles, yes, but behind every gleaming eye of bronze was the unseen gaze of their master. It was a world refashioned, the jagged edges of the republic smoothed into marble. The chaos of civil war now forgotten like a fevered dream. Freedom, once the sacred breath of Rome, had been exchanged for order, for safety, for peace so deep it echoed like silence in a sanctuary. And the people they cheered, not because they were blind, but because they remembered. They remembered Marius and Sulla, blood in the streets. They remembered Caesar cut down beneath Pompey's gaze. They remembered the flames of the Forum, the heads nailed to the rostra, the hunger, the fear. And now there was light. There were temples restored, crops gathered, victories unending. Liberty had not been taken, it had been surrendered gently, gratefully. Augustus did not gloat, he did not rule with cruelty. His hand was steady, his reforms sweeping, his vision vast. He was a gardener of civilization, planting systems that would flower long after his bones had returned to dust. But even as he shaped eternity, he understood mortality. He crafted succession, adopted heirs, watched them fall. One by one they slipped through his grasp, illness, scandal, exile, failure. Fate, as always, obeyed no man's architecture. In the end, it would not be his blood, but his system that endured. Rome had once prided itself on libertas, the fierce and noble chaos of consent. Now it possessed something different. Empire, the word was rarely spoken, but it was everywhere, in the echo of boots on stone roads, in the inscriptions of distant cities, in the silence of the Senate. In the pulse of the people who no longer asked who rules, but how long will he live. Augustus did not fear death, he prepared for it. He arranged the marble of memory before the tomb was sealed. He wrote his deeds, engraved them, copied them, scattered them like seeds across the world he had made. A man shaping how he would be remembered, knowing full well that memory is the last throne. When he died, Rome did not weep in terror. It sighed not in sorrow, but in continuity. For by then he had become more than man, he had become Rome itself, and the empire now born would carry his name like a shadow across centuries. Not in freedom, not in fire, but in the gold-drenched hush of order. A silence that no republic could ever have sustained. From a city of exiles and wolves, a god emperor had risen, and the world had changed forever. The sun had barely dimmed on the age of Augustus when shadows crept in behind his golden throne. The empire he had carved, so vast, so clean in its marble illusions, now passed into the hands of his heir, not by blood but by necessity, Tiberius. He was no Caesar by birth, but Rome accepted him as such, for there were no better choices. The will of Augustus had sealed it, but wills, like marble statues, can crack. And beneath the surface of the new reign, something cold stirred. Tiberius did not shine, he did not inspire. He did not call forth oaths from the lips of men or songs from the mouths of poets. He ruled with a face like weathered granite, dry-eyed and distant. Duty had forced him upon the world stage, but affection had long since withered within him. He had known exile, humiliation, betrayal. And when he came to power, he did so not to rule, but to escape being ruled by others. Rome, under his watch, did not fall, it did not break, it obeyed silently. The great engine of the empire still turned, governors were appointed, roads maintained, borders held, but the air within the capital thickened slowly like smoke in a locked chamber. Tiberius did not walk among the people. He did not laugh in the forum or command in the battlefield's dust. Instead, he vanished not into death but into retreat. To the island of Capri, high atop cliffs that dropped into sapphire depths, he fled. There, surrounded by perfumed courtiers and guarded halls, he ruled the world from afar. His letters arrived in Rome like cold winds off the sea, stern, clipped, laced with veiled threats. They bore no affection, only directives. No warmth, only weight, and from Capri he watched. He watched senators flatter and betray. He watched generals rise and whisper. He watched citizens praise him while placing bets on his death. And in that watching, suspicion festered. To Tiberius, every smile hid a dagger, every friend a spy, and so he answered in kind. The old republican virtues, clemency, transparency, the dignity of dissent, dissolved like salt in water. In their place rose the mailed hand of fear. Treason trials returned, slow at first, then swift. Men accused of murmurs, of glances, of dreams. Informers thrived, rewarded with gold and land for each name they gave. Prison cells filled with those who had once walked free. Senators bled into their baths rather than face the shame of public execution. He entrusted power to a man who reflected his dread, Sejanus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, the very blade of Rome's hidden will. At first, Sejanus served, then he whispered, then he reached. With each letter, Tiberius seemed to vanish further into the mists of Capri, while Sejanus tightened his grip around the city's throat. He walked where the emperor would not. He was punished without pause. He smiled and drank with men who would be dead within days. His name rang through the marble corridors of power like the footsteps of fate. But ambition cannot help itself. When Sejanus reached too far, seeking the imperial family, seeking bloodline, Tiberius awakened. The letter that arrived in Rome that day bore no seal of rage, only cold command. Sejanus was summoned to the Senate, praised publicly, then condemned with a gesture. The same senators who had once poured wine in his honor now tore his name from their ledgers and cast his body to the mob. But the damage was done. Tiberius had no more illusions. If Sejanus, his closest, could betray, then what of the rest? Capri became his kingdom of shadows. He wandered its cliffs and chambers in silence, whispering to the sea as Rome whispered about him. He refused to return. He refused to die. His name remained on every decree, his face on every coin, and yet his presence became a myth. Children spoke of the emperor as a ghost. Courtiers bowed to statues in his absence. The empire was ruled by echoes, and the people, they waited not for justice, not for change. They waited for his death, for with each year of Tiberius' silence, the marble of Rome wore thinner. And beneath it, something darker pressed upward, a madness not of chaos, but of control. The republic had vanished. The empire remained, but now it no longer whispered promises, it whispered fear. At first, it felt like light had returned to Rome. After the long, gray decay of Tiberius, after years of silence and dread pouring from the cliffs of Capri, the city exhaled. The chains of fear fell silent, and into the vacuum stepped a youth crowned not just with power, but with love. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, the people called him, but Rome knew him by a softer name, Caligula, Little Boots. The boy was raised among soldiers, the child of camps, the grandson of beloved Agrippa, the son of Germanicus, the people's hero taken too soon. When the Senate proclaimed his rule, the city wept with joy. Temples echoed with hymns, prison doors opened, exiles returned, games thundered through the Colosseum like a festival of rebirth. For the first time in years, Rome laughed again. The young prince had the look of divinity, golden-haired, bright-eyed, a sculpted god-given flesh. He walked among the people. Tossed coins from balconies. He embraced the crowds with tears in his eyes, claiming he would be their servant, not their master. For 6 months, the illusion held, but even stars, when they burn too bright, collapse into something darker. A fever struck. Some say it was an illness of the brain, others a poison delivered by those already alarmed by the adoration he commanded. Whatever it was, Caligula fell into unconsciousness, hovered near death, and then returned, altered. The joy drained from his face. The warmth fled his voice, and the city, once blooming in his name, began to feel the frost. He began to speak of gods not in worship, but in rivalry. He adorned himself in the garb of Jupiter. He strode into temples and commanded the priests to remove the statues, for there was no longer need of them. Rome had a god who breathed. He built golden bridges from palace to temple so he could walk across the sky like Apollo himself. He called forth his horse Incitatus not to race but to rule. A marble stall, a jeweled collar, a home of ivory and purple linen. He whispered to the Senate that the beast would be made consul. Some laughed, then they stopped laughing. The treasury drained not into wars but into vanity. Temples were paved with silver. Games bled into months filled with spectacles so vast they rivaled the moon. Ships became floating palaces. A 2-mile bridge of boats was lashed across the Bay of Baiae so that Caligula could ride across it in golden armor, mocking a prophecy that no man could do so. He returned from his ride and declared victory over Neptune. Spears were cast into the sea, shells gathered as spoils of war. He paraded them through Rome in a procession of silence and disbelief. Senators sat in silence, eyes downcast, hands trembling. They were no longer lawmakers, they were hostages of performance. Those who defied him vanished, those who questioned him bled. He would summon nobles to his feasts and laugh as they choked on their own fear. He spoke of death casually as a brushstroke, a tool. He claimed the power to kill with a glance and practiced it with ease. One day he stood before a line of prisoners and drew his hand across his throat. All were executed, no reason given, none needed. He spoke to the moon, he consorted with his sisters, then condemned them. One, Drusilla, he loved above all. When she died, whether by illness or command, he buried her with rites reserved for empresses and declared her a goddess. He wept not for her but for himself, because gods should not grieve, and he now believed himself divine. Rome, once the heart of reason and law, now pulsed with lunacy. The empire stretched still from ocean to ocean, but at its core stood a man who no longer saw borders or men or meaning. He saw only the stage of eternity and himself at its center. The crowds that once wept for him now murmured in fear. The streets emptied at his approach. The Senate, broken and obedient, dreamed in whispers of what might end this living nightmare. But Caligula did not dream. He raged, he rejoiced, he was destroyed. And in the dead of night, beneath torches and shadows, the empire's quiet heart began to beat with another rhythm, one of daggers being drawn and destiny preparing to strike. The god of Rome was mortal, and somewhere someone had remembered. Night fell on Rome like a curtain soaked in oil. The city, eternal and sprawling, groaned beneath the weight of summer, a furnace of stone, dry wind, and whispered resentment. Markets closed early. Lamps burned low. In the narrow alleyways where marble met shadow, something ancient stirred, not war, not famine, but flame. And high above it all, in the golden halls of the Palatine, sat the emperor, Nero. He was young, beautiful, touched by a theatrical god, a patron of the lyre, not the sword. He did not dream of provinces or conquest. He dreamed of verses, of masks, of applause that never ceased. To him, power was not for protection, but performance. The empire was a stage, and all who lived within it actors to be cast or discarded. When the fire came, it came as if summoned by his mind. The first spark was small, a market stall near the Circus Maximus, kindling, crackling in the dark. Then a guest, a second flame, a third, and then the wind turned, as if guided by omen or malice, and Rome ignited. For 6 days and 7 nights the inferno devoured the city. Temples collapsed, statues cracked. Roof tiles burst in bursts of steam. Homes, tenements, theaters, all swallowed in the slow, grinding feast of fire. Screams rang through the alleys, families clawed through smoke-choked streets. The Tiber hissed as ash rained down, and where was Nero? Not among the people, not with the soldiers. He stood atop the tower of Maecenas, draped in silk, crowned in garlands, a lyre in hand, his face bathed in an orange glow. And as Rome died below him, he sang not in madness but in awe, a song of Troy, the fall of another city, the birth of another myth. When the smoke lifted, half of Rome had become cinders, and yet from those ashes Nero did not mourn. He planned. The Domus Aurea, the golden house, rose from ruin like a god's palace. A lake, a colossus, halls of marble veined with gold, dining rooms where ceilings rained perfume, rotating platforms mimicking the motion of the heavens. A dwelling not for a man, but for a god made flesh. He claimed it was for the people. They watched with empty hands. To mask the fire, he cast blame not upon nature nor negligence, but upon the Christians, a new sect, strange in dress, secret in ritual, defiant in spirit. He called them arsonists, enemies of man and heaven. And so they were dragged from homes, from catacombs, from dreams, tied to stakes, coated in pitch, lit as torches in his gardens. Nero walked among them barefoot, laughing, but even gardens of fire could not silence Rome forever. The senators whispered, the generals murmured. Own mother Agrippina, iron-hearted, the architect of his rise, he had murdered. His wife, pregnant and radiant, he kicked her to death in a fit of rage. And still he sang, still he wrote plays. Still he performed on stage, demanding an ovation, demanding tears. The people who had once adored him now stared blankly as his chariots raced, as his poems stumbled, as his masks cracked. Plots rose like weeds. Rebellions flared. In Gaul, in Spain, legions declared him no longer worthy. The Senate, slow to act, now moved swiftly. He was condemned as a public enemy, and Nero, once god, once star, once fire, ran. He fled Rome not as a lion, but as a fugitive, through gardens and stables in disguise with only a handful of slaves. He begged for poison, none would grant it. He wept, he trembled. He dug his own grave and dared his servant to strike. The sword pierced his throat. And as the life bled from his veins, his final words shivered into the air. What an artist dies in me. No army remained, no heir stood ready, no monument honored his passing, only silence, only ash, and behind it all the city eternal once more licking its wounds in the shadow of a golden palace built on flame. Rome had seen emperors of war. Now it had survived an emperor of ruin. And though the fire had died, the embers would smolder for generations. A hush had fallen across the empire, not the silence of fear, nor the silence of ruin, but something rarer, balance. In the long shadow left by fire and madness, Rome found itself breathing again. The emperors who followed did not demand worship. They did not wear crowns of divinity or drain the treasury in orgies of excess. They walked the marble of the Palatine with reason in their step and justice in their breath. They ruled not for spectacle, but for stewardship. And among them, last and most luminous, sat a man not of bloodlust or ambition, but of thought, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor. A man forged not by the arena, but by discipline, not by conquest, but by conscience. He did not seek the throne, it was placed in his hands, as if the empire itself longed to be held by someone who would not crush it. His brow carried the weight of the empire, but his eyes were turned inward. While others pursued power for its wine and thunder, Marcus listened for quieter truths, the whisper of virtue, the ache of duty, the fragile strength of restraint. He ruled with a pen and with a sword, but he trusted the pen more. In the quiet of his tent far from Rome's marble temples, he wrote, not laws, not decrees, reflections. Meditations they would later be called, not meant for the world but for the self. Lines carved in Greek like prayers without gods, a journal in the dust, a dialogue with mortality. Look within, he wrote, as legions sharpen blades beyond the firelight. For within is the fountain of good, and it will ever bubble up if thou wilt ever dig. Yet the world, ever impatient, did not grant him peace. War rose like frost on early leaves, first in whispers, then in waves. To the north the Danube frontier cracked. Germanic tribes, fierce and many, surged across the boundaries of the empire like rivers in thaw. The barbarians, as Rome called them, did not fight for territory, they fought for survival, driven by famine, by fear, by the eternal pulse of desperation. And Marcus, the quiet scholar, went to war. He wore the armor of the emperor's past. He led from the front, not from the balcony or throne, but among the mud and snow, the screams and iron. His face, carved with lines deeper than age, became a beacon for soldiers who had known only command by cruelty. They followed not out of fear but belief. Through icy forests and blinding snow, across bloodied fields and frozen rivers, Marcus held the frontier. Years passed. The empire did not shrink, it endured, because he did. But war changes all men, even the wise. He saw the fragility of the world, how easily order fell to fire, how quickly law dissolved in the howl of the wild. He feared not for his reign, but for what would come after. He had no clear heir. His co-ruler Lucius Verus, bright but soft, died too soon. Plague swept through the empire like a black wind, stealing thousands, then millions. Cities emptied, provinces bled. And still Marcus wrote, "Do not waste what remains of your life in speculating about your neighbors," he scrawled beneath flickering light as soldiers died around him. "Be content with your small but well-ordered mind." The gods offered no answer, and so in the absence of certainty he did what so few emperors had done, he kept faith with himself. Not with divine right, not with prophecy, but with duty. In battle he showed mercy. In victory, restraint. He restored dignity to offices long hollowed by tyrants. He lived with austerity even when the palace begged him to shine. He ruled not as a god-made man, but as a man trying to be good. Yet fate, cunning as ever, prepared one final test. For in the quiet of legacy, Marcus placed his trust and his hope in his son, Commodus. The boy was strong, golden, and admired, but the child of a philosopher is not always born with a philosopher's soul. Marcus, perhaps tired of war, perhaps tired of losing those he loved, anointed him. And as the north burned and the meditations closed and the last great emperor lay dying beneath a winter sky, the empire turned its face and the age of gold began to crack. The philosopher's breath had barely faded when the sun stepped forward. Where Marcus Aurelius had whispered to the soul, Commodus roared to the crowd. He inherited not his father's meditations, but his mantle, the laureled burden of the Roman world. Yet the crown, once worn with solemn humility, now gleamed like a toy in the hands of a boy who mistook applause for virtue. From his earliest steps, Commodus had been treated not as heir to duty, but as heir to divinity. Raised in marble chambers where no word was ever no, surrounded by flatterers whose praise drowned caution, he grew not into a mirror of Marcus, but into a reflection of Rome's softening under gold. The empire had known madness before Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, but this was something new, indulgence wrapped in strength, vanity armored in legacy. Commodus was not a tyrant of intellect or ideology. He was a child born into absolute power, and he played with it like a lion cub unaware of its own claws. He did not govern, he entertained me. He did not contemplate, he performed. And Rome, weary from decades of law and war and discipline, leaned forward. At first there was charm. He smiled and the people smiled back. He walked among them, fed the hungry, offered coin. Statues of his youth adorned public halls, the boy emperor, the divine son. But beneath the silk the shadow lengthened. The Senate, once revered, became a gallery of puppets. Advisors who offered truth were exiled, then executed. Those who fed the dream were elevated, fools made prefects, sycophants crowned with command. Then came the games. He did not simply watch. He entered the arena. The Colosseum, once a stage for slaves and beasts, now opened its gates for Caesar. Commodus descended in golden armor, lionskin draped over his shoulders, clutching a club in emulation of Hercules, a god he believed himself to be reborn. He demanded the people cheer, and they did, not out of love but out of dread. He fought not gladiators of skill but of obedience. They fell before him like props in a farce. He slaughtered hundreds of animals, lions, ostriches, elephants, each kill accompanied by the roar of the crowd, the music of horns, the tossing of coins. The emperor, once guardian of peace, now bathed in blood for spectacle. Rome, the heart of civilization, had become a stage for the fantasies of a man who believed himself immortal. He renamed the months after his own titles, declared himself the new Romulus. The Senate called him not imperator, but the champion, the invincible, the god of the Colosseum. Statues of him as Hercules rose across the empire, bulging with impossible muscle, crowned with lion's teeth, holding the world like a bauble. Yet beneath the laughter, fear simmered. For Commodus, now lost in his myth, saw enemies in every shadow. Governors were recalled and killed. Generals fell by decree. He trusted none, loved few, and drifted deeper into a world where reality bent around his ego. His sister, Lucilla, once beloved, plotted against him. When the scheme failed, he had her executed. Not quietly, not cleanly. The empire's limbs twitched under his hand. Grain shipments faltered. Provinces grew restless. In the north, the tribes stirred again, sensing weakness behind the marble face of Rome. And in the streets, the people still cheered, louder than before, not because they adored him, but because they remembered Caligula. They remembered Nero. They remembered what happened to those who did not applaud. Commodus fought in the arena hundreds of times. Each time, the Senate was forced to watch. Senators, men whose ancestors had defied kings, now bowed before a man who smeared blood on their robes and laughed. They feared not his strength, but his whim. And somewhere in the darkened halls of the Palatine, Rome itself, the dream, the order, the dignity, began to tremble, not because the empire was failing, but because it no longer knew what it had become. A gladiator sat on the throne, and though the people still cheered, they could sense it. The curtain would fall. And when it did, it would fall in blood. In the quiet after the arena's roar, when the blood had dried and the banners had fallen limp, Rome awoke to a strange emptiness, as though a breath had been held too long and no lungs remained to exhale. Commodus was dead, strangled in his bath by a slave with trembling hands. The god emperor, lion slayer, gladiator king fell not in battle nor rebellion, but in a whispered act of desperation. No marble arch would bear his name. No Senate hymn would mourn him. Rome did not weep, it exhaled, but peace did not follow. A door had been opened not by invaders nor by flames, but by the slow corrosion of meaning. For years the throne had been draped in illusion. Now it was simply empty, and from the dust rose a truth more dangerous than any tyrant anyone could rule. In the days that followed, chaos wore the toga. The Praetorian Guard, once guardians of the palace, became its auctioneers. They did not elect an emperor. They sold one. Upon the marble steps of power, Didius Julianus purchased the Roman Empire like a merchant haggling for olive oil. Gold changed hands, oaths were made, and Rome watched as its soul was bartered in coins. The people rioted. The legions, far from the capital, seethed. Honor had not been sold, it had been mocked. And so began a new rhythm, not of dynasties, but of upheavals. Emperors rose not through lineage or law, but through steel. Septimius Severus marched on Rome with African discipline and Eastern fire. He crushed the usurpers, bought the guard with bribes of loyalty, and seized the purple with hands still wet with war. For a time, order returned, but it was a brittle kind. Severus ruled as a soldier, not a statesman. He feared the Senate. He trusted the sword. He fortified the empire's edges, but let its heart decay. And as he lay dying in Britannia, his words to his sons were simple and fatal: enrich the soldiers, despise all others. It was a prophecy dressed as advice. His son Caracalla followed with wrath. He slaughtered his own brother in their mother's arms. Blood ran across the imperial halls like spilled ink over parchment. He offered citizenship to all, not out of love, but for taxes. He built baths grand enough to rival temples, then left Rome for endless campaigns that bled coffers and patience alike. He too was murdered by a soldier. Another followed, then another. They came not to reign, but to survive. One by one they donned the purple and marched into legend or obscurity. Elagabalus with his perfumes and priests of the sun, Alexander Severus with his mother's council and military mutiny. Each emperor lit a candle in the wind. Each reign a season barely began before it turned. Rome still stood, the aqueduct still flowed. The road still shone beneath the sun and sandals, but something beneath the surface had changed. The facade of glory remained, yet behind it lay fractures fine at first, then widening. The army, once Rome's shield, became its master. Loyalty belonged to generals, not to the state. Provinces waited not for orders from the capital, but for banners from the barracks. The Senate, once the heart of deliberation, now sat in silence, bowing to whomever marched last. And across the frontiers the winds shifted. The Rhine froze early, the Danube whispered unrest. In the east, Persia no longer bowed, it glared. Barbarians tested the gates, not yet in waves, but in ripples. Scouts disappeared, fortresses flickered like candles in the storm's prelude. And the people, citizens, merchants, farmers, felt the change. Not through edicts or battles, but through absence, grain delayed, taxes rising, justice fatting. The empire no longer ruled with confidence, it ruled with memory. Rome still believed in itself, but belief is not truth, it is echo, and echoes fade. Temples still shone, senators still feasted, poets still praised. But beyond the marble and myth, the empire's skin had begun to thin. What had once been unity was now inertia. What had once been pride was now nostalgia. And somewhere beneath the weight of its own greatness, Rome began to bow. Not yet to fall, but to learn, and the wind was rising. Under a pallid sky, thick with stormlight and smoke, two armies faced each other by the rushing waters of the Tiber. Spears caught the wind like a forest of iron, and shields flickered with the sun's last hesitant glow. It was the eve of reckoning, and Rome itself held its breath. Constantine stood alone on the riverbank, apart from his generals, apart from the weight of centuries. His cloak, fastened with imperial gold, stirred faintly in the breeze. Yet his gaze was turned not to the enemy, nor to the tide, but to the sky, as though searching for something greater than fate. And there, in the silence before dawn, when the veil between worlds thins, he saw it. A cross of fire traced upon the heavens, a symbol not of Jupiter or Mars, but of the strange new god whispered about in shadows and tombs. Around it a phrase: in this sign conquer. It burned in the firmament like an omen carved into the vault of time itself. Later some would call it a dream, others a fabrication, but to Constantine it was a revelation. He commanded his soldiers to paint the Chi-Rho, the sign of Christ, upon their shields. Pagan men, hardened by war and raised beneath marble temples of forgotten gods, now carried the emblem of an invisible kingdom into battle. At Milvian Bridge, Rome turned. The clash was fury incarnate. Hooves churned mud into blood, and the cries of the dying curled like smoke into the sky. The river swallowed the bodies of the broken, while arrows sang through the mist. And upon the earth Constantine advanced like the hand of divine judgment. Maxentius, the rival, the usurper, the last vestige of old Rome's defiance, fell into the waters with his collapsing bridge. No epic ending, no noble speech. Just a crown sinking beneath waves, lost in mud and legend. And from that bloodied field a new Rome emerged. It did not trumpet conquest with the blare of war horns, but with the echo of prayers spoken in candle-lit crypts. Constantine, now sole ruler of the West, did not merely claim the empire, he claimed the heavens. In the years that followed, the sun god was forgotten. Altars to forgotten deities crumbled beneath ivy and time. The emperor, once a child of Jupiter, now called himself servant of Christ. Bishops replaced augurs. Churches bloomed where temples withered. The state wrapped itself in scripture. But this was no humble conversion. It was a strategy of thrones and eternity. Constantine did not kneel, he ascended. He summoned the bishops to Nicaea, robes flowing like seafoam, and forged not just unity but empire in creed. Heresies were declared treason. Doctrine became law. The invisible now ruled the visible, and the sword became the guardian of mystery. The empire's soul, once divided among 1,000 gods, began to cleave toward one. But even as Christ rose above the capital, the earth beneath began to groan. For while Constantine built churches in Byzantium and adorned the East with marble dreams, the frontiers darkened. Beyond the Rhine and Danube, beneath the shadows of pines and frost, a tide gathered, not just in numbers but in hunger for land, for warmth, for gold. The barbarians had always lingered at the edge of Rome's map, names etched in fear, spoken like curses: Goths, Vandals, Franks. They had been enemies, mercenaries, curiosities, but now they were nations. They moved like forests uprooted. They crossed rivers with their children, their carts, their gods. They came not to raid but to stay. And as Christianity spread through the empire like wildfire in dry grass, the old Roman order withered. The Senate sat in marbled silence. The legions, once loyal to Rome, pledged fealty to whomever fed them. The emperors multiplied east and west, splitting power like splitting a loaf of bread too thin to feed a starving crowd. Constantine saw the storm, but he could not stop it. He shifted his throne to the east, to Byzantium, and crowned it Constantinople, a city of 7 hills echoing Rome yet facing the dawn. There, amid domes and mosaics, he imagined a kingdom that might endure. But he died with the West in question and the future undecided. In the catacombs beneath the empire, the faithful still gathered. In whispers, they spoke of another world, one not of marble or law, but of resurrection. The martyrs had once been thrown to beasts, now they were saints carved in stone. Constantine had baptized the empire, yes, but the water had not yet washed away the blood. The faith was real, but so were the shadows, for a sword can defend a cross or use it. And as the sun set on his reign, one truth remained. A sign had been seen in the heavens, and the world had changed, not in silence nor in peace, but in the trembling hush that comes before both birth and ruin. The empire marched on, but not as it once had. The old gods were dying, and something new had taken root in their ashes. Snow fell on the marble roofs of Constantinople, not as a blanket, but as a warning, a dusting of silence over towers built to defy time. The city stood proud, a second Rome, cast in domes and gold. But beneath its glimmer, the empire was beginning to fracture, not by sword, but by soul. From the windswept Alps to the banks of the Bosphorus, something old had begun to break. Once the empire had marched beneath one banner, one law, one Caesar. Now 2 thrones ruled a house divided. East and West, not rivals, yet not kin. They shared the name of Rome, but not the heart. In the East, wealth flowered, silk draped the markets. Greek tongues filled the air, and the city's pulse beat with 1,000 years of commerce and learning. Byzantium, rechristened Constantinople, was no mere capital. It was an idea forged in divine ambition, its basilicas filled with golden halos and incense rising like memory. In the West, Rome still clung to its bones. The marble chipped, the forums faded, and the legions were fewer, thinned by treason and time. The Senate spoke still, but its voice was hushed, a whisper beneath the crash of invading tribes. Gaul trembled, Britannia faded. And in the shadow of broken aqueducts, the barbarians crept closer. Yet the empire's deeper wound ran beneath flags and frontiers. It bled from the soul. For faith, once a hidden flame flickering in catacombs, had grown into a roaring fire. And fire, even holy fire, consumes. The bishops no longer hid in the shadows. They stood in palaces, wielding scripture like decree. But not all light was the same. Disputes not of Rome, but of heaven, now shaped the destiny of emperors. What was Christ, mortal or divine, son or symbol, word made flesh or word misunderstood? From Antioch to Alexandria, the questions became battlegrounds. Councils were summoned. Scrolls were burned. And those who dared to preach a different Christ found themselves chained or slain not by pagans but by fellow Christians. Heresy was no longer a whisper. It was a sword. Arianism rose bold and precise, declaring the Son lesser than the Father. To some it was reason, to others blasphemy. The Council of Nicaea had tried to silence it, but truth once split cannot be mended with parchment. In the East, emperors swayed with the tides of doctrine. Some favored the Arians. Others fought them. Faith became a court intrigue. Bishops rose and fell like senators. The imperial robes of Constantinople bore the scent not only of incense but of theological blood. Meanwhile, in the West, the Church began to root itself deeper into the soil. Rome, though fading in might, found new strength in mystery. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, claimed a voice not merely of counsel but of judgment. Petrine authority, they called it. That Peter, the fisherman turned martyr, had passed the keys of heaven to the city of wolves. Eastern patriarchs scoffed. Constantinople had the emperor, the gold, the armies. Why kneel to a bishop draped in Latin dust? And so the soul of Christendom fractured with the empire. Doctrine diverged, languages split. Latin and Greek became more than words, they became walls. The East looked to ceremony, to icons and philosophy, to the eternal dance of logos and light. The West, bruised and battered, clung to authority, a single church, a single creed, a single pope. Yet even amid division, a strange unity lingered, the belief that the empire, broken as it was, still held meaning, that the cross had not replaced the eagle but adorned it, that Caesar was still ruled by God's hand, whether crowned in Rome or in Byzantium. But empires do not decay in noise, they dissolve in silence, and the silence was growing. The emperors of the West, weak and weary, died in the shadows. Their names are lost, footnotes to ruin, puppet kings in a court of ghosts. Real power belonged to generals, to warlords, to foreign tribes paid in gold that no longer gleamed. In the East, emperors ruled with iron etiquette, wrapped in silks and guarded by eunuchs and law. They proclaimed divine right, yet their thrones shook with every theological wind. Constantinople stood, but it stood alone. What had been one world was now two mirrors, each reflecting an empire it no longer fully recognized. And yet, amid all this, Byzantium began to rise. She learned to survive. While the West bled beneath barbarian boots, the East adapted. It traded, debated, and endured. Where Rome had ruled through roads and legions, Byzantium ruled through intrigue, diplomacy, and gold. She became a spider in silk, weaving her web from Africa to Persia, cloaked in liturgy and law. The Hagia Sophia rose, not just a church but a testament, a dome like the sky itself, filled with stars and echoes. And as voices sang within its sacred walls, the world outside shifted. The barbarians had come, the gods had fallen. The emperors no longer shared a crown. But Byzantium remained. The empire was divided, the faith was divided. But the dream lingered still. It came not with the thunder of legions, nor with the trumpet of triumph, but with a silence so deep it seemed the gods themselves had turned their faces away. In the year 410 after Christ, the eternal city fell. Rome, the navel of empire, the womb of civilization, the iron flame that had scorched the world, opened its gates not in conquest but in surrender. The hands that once carved empires now trembled in fear. No prophet could have seen it clearly. No poem could bear the weight of its shame. From the north, through the smoke of ruined frontiers, came a people shaped by hardship and fury. The Goths, born of ice and exile, hammered by Roman betrayal, had once begged for peace. They had sought land, dignity, a place within the great Roman machine, But Rome, ever proud, had mocked their hunger and answered it with cruelty. And now they return not as guests but as wolves. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, did not ride with arrogance but with vengeance buried in his bones. His was not a rage of impulse but of memory, the memory of starving children, slaughtered kin, and treaties broken by Roman tongues. He had marched through the empire's veins for years, testing its resolve, surrounding its pride. And when the west proved hollow, he made for its heart. 3 times he encamped at Rome's gates. 3 times he offered mercy. 3 times he was rebuffed. But the 4th time, there were no gods left to beg for mercy. There were only shadows. A slave opened the Salarian gate in the dead of night. No great battle was fought. No last stand echoed in the forums. The city that had survived Hannibal, Jugurtha, and the Gauls, the city that believed itself immortal, fell with barely a scream. Alaric and his Goths poured in, not as madmen, but as a tide both mournful and merciless. They moved through crumbling temples and silent villas, not with reverence but with a solemn hunger, not for gold but for recognition. For 3 days and nights the eternal city was unmade. The marble god stood powerless. Jupiter's great temple, that ancient bastion of Roman divinity, was plundered. The palace of emperors, once brimming with silk and command, was stripped bare. Fires bloomed in alleyways. Laughter curdled into sobs. And the Tiber, that ancient river of myths, carried ash instead of glory. Yet this was no apocalypse of blind chaos. Alaric had sworn to his men no massacre, no desecration of churches, no blood for blood's sake. The sack of Rome would not be remembered as a pagan frenzy, but as a measured verdict, a reckoning upon centuries of Roman arrogance. Still the blow was mortal. The Senate, what remained of it, cowered. Nobles fled in disguise, their purple robes traded for peasant cloaks. Gold crucifixes were pried from altars. Statues were toppled not by edict but by grief. The people of Rome, the plebs who once chanted for bread and spectacle, now knelt in dust, praying not for empire but for survival. In Bethlehem, the theologian Jerome wept into his ink. "If Rome can perish," he wrote, "what is safe?" The echo of that question would ring through all of Christendom. Because something deeper than stone had crumbled. Rome had not just lost its wealth but its myth. The illusion that it was divinely guarded, that it was the axis of the world, was shattered. No longer the sun around which the world turned, it became a relic of past light. The West began to die not with a sword to the throat, but with a whisper in the soul. And yet Alaric did not stay. He left Rome behind as if it no longer interested him. There was no crown upon his brow, no throne beneath his feet. His victory was not the founding of a new empire, but the funeral of an old one. Soon after, he died not by blade, but by fate. On his way south, seeking ships to cross to Africa, Alaric was struck down by fever. In death, his legend was sealed not in marble, but in earth and river. His men, to protect their king from desecration, diverted the flow of the Bucento River, buried him beneath its dry bed with treasures looted from a dying Rome, then let the waters flow again. Every slave who labored in that burial was put to the sword so no tongue could betray the secret. Thus the man who broke Rome was buried beneath silence, but the world would never be the same. What followed was not immediate collapse but slow unraveling. Provinces still bore the eagle. Emperors still donned the laurel, but the West had become a theater of ghosts, a memory pretending to be a nation. Rome, once the heartbeat of empire, now beats irregularly, an echo instead of a command. And across the windswept fields of Europe, the tribes stirred. They had seen the fall, they had walked the broken streets, and they had understood a terrible truth: even gods can fall, even empires can bleed. The empire still breathed. Though the eagle no longer soared over Gaul or Britain, though the purple robes of emperors in the West lay dusted and forgotten in broken halls in the East, beneath the golden dome of Constantinople, Rome was not yet ash. It lived transfigured not in the hands of senators, but in the vision of one man whose eyes shimmered with the fire of ancient glory: Justinian. Born not in marble courts, but in the coarse mud of Illyrian fields, the emperor rose not by birth, but by mind and by fate. His soul did not sing with poetry, nor did it ache with the rhythm of the old republic. His was the flame of precision, of law, of granite will. He was the last great sculptor of Roman destiny, and in his hands the empire would blaze once more, not as the thunder of legion, but as the echo of eternity. The 6th century bore a strange light. The Western world was fractured, its cities ruled by Goths, its temples cracked, its roads grown wild with thorn and silence. But in the East, Constantinople gleamed like a vision set apart from time. There, surrounded by the azure skin of the Bosphorus, stood the last heartbeat of Rome, guarded by walls of titanic stone and filled with markets that whispered in 100 tongues. And at its center, Justinian ruled like a shadow of Caesar wrapped in divine authority. He did not dream of peace. He dreamt of order, of one God, one empire, one law. To shape the world in his image, he began with the word. The laws of Rome, once a torrent of parchments and precedent, had grown twisted by centuries of contradiction. Justinian swept it clean. He summoned the jurists, he summoned the scrolls, and under the torches of ceaseless labor he forged the corpus juris civilis, the body of civil law. It was not merely legislation, it was scripture, a monument in ink, a distillation of 1,000 years of Roman reason, bound not in chaos but in clarity. Through it the emperor spoke across time. But laws alone cannot raise the soul. Justinian turned next to stone. When the old cathedral burned in riot, when mobs screamed for vengeance in the hippodrome and the sky turned red with revolt, he did not flee. He did not bend. He rebuilt, not with haste but with awe. Hagia Sophia, the church of holy wisdom, rose as if summoned by angels, its dome defying gravity, its windows alight with gold and sapphire glass. Columns soared like prayers, marble whispered with veins of purple and green. And when the final stone was set, Justinian entered its vaults and uttered words carried by history like a hymn. Solomon, I have surpassed thee. Within those walls, the old gods vanished. Jupiter's roar was replaced by chants, and yet somehow the sacred silence of Rome endured. But Justinian's gaze turned westward to lands held by barbarians who had once been students, allies, enemies. In Italy, the Ostrogoths claimed the bones of the empire. In North Africa, the Vandals laughed behind ships laden with plunder. To Justinian, this was not mere loss. It was heresy, it was a disorder, and it could not stand. So he summoned war. His sword was not drawn by his own hand, but by his general Belisarius. A man of tact and thunder, of loyalty and pain, Belisarius marched across the sea with legions slim in number but sharp as fire. He struck Carthage like lightning, cleaving through the Vandal kingdom in days. Then to Sicily, to Naples, to Rome, cities both Roman and yet not, wrapped in decay and memory. Each conquest was not merely a battle but a resurrection, and yet each cost more than the last. In Rome, the eternal city welcomed its old flag like a ghost returning home. But the ghosts of the empire were not silent. The Gothic wars dragged like a knife through the earth, years upon years of siege and famine, betrayal and plague. What Justinian sought to reclaim, he often left in ruin. And still he pushed forward. The treasury bled. The people groaned. The East trembled beneath the weight of the West. But the emperor did not relent. He believed he had been chosen. He believed that through him God's will was manifest, yet heaven had its own tempests. A plague fell upon the empire, black, unseen, cruel. It crept through ports, markets, and homes. It bloated the dead and blackened the living. It killed soldiers, merchants, priests, and children. It even brought emperors to the brink. Justinian himself fell into fevered silence, his life balanced on a breath, his empire slipping beneath the shadow of death. But he survived, thinner, more spectral, and rose from his bed with an even colder resolve. The dream, though battered, would not die. Justinian reigned for nearly 4 decades. He rebuilt aqueducts, restored cities, sent missionaries eastward and laws westward. He was never loved, but he was feared, and in his silence he believed that fear was enough. When he died, the empire mourned not with weeping, but with weariness. The dream had cost too much. The West, though briefly held, slipped once more into the arms of warlords. Italy lay scorched. Africa fell to new flames. And the gold of Byzantium dulled beneath the dust of time. Yet something strange endured. The law, the church, The stones of Hagia Sophia, the very idea of Rome not as a city but as order, pulsed on. And so Justinian, last of the emperors in the old mold, became not a man but a bridge, 1 foot in Caesar's world, 1 foot in Christ. A figure cast in iron and fire, hated, praised, misunderstood. He had not saved the empire, but he had delayed its death. And in that delay he etched one final spark into the darkness. The year was 476. It did not begin with thunder, no stars fell, no trumpets wailed, the earth did not split. And yet within the silence of its passing a world ended. Rome, the mother of laws, the mistress of continents, the eternal flame, was no more, not on fire, not in triumph, but in surrender. The Western Empire, once carved by the sword of Augustus and baptized in the blood of Caesar, was a hollowed husk. Its cities were withered, its legions scattered, its people weary. For decades, emperors had come and gone like the fatting of shadows of puppets behind curtains, their crowns traded like coins, their names forgotten by the very stones they ruled. And now at last there was one more, Romulus, a boy not yet a man. His name echoed ancient power, Romulus, the founder, Augustus the first. But he held neither the fire of conquest nor the wisdom of rule. He was an echo of an echo, a brittle ember in a furnace long gone cold. He wore a purple robe, but it fit him like a ghost shroud. He reigned not from strength, but from suffering. Beyond Rome's gates, another name had risen, Odoacer, a warrior born of the Germanic tribes, tempered by war and hardened by loss. He did not kneel before the memory of emperors. He did not tremble at marble columns or Latin verse. He came with iron, and iron speaks with finality. There was no grand battle, no hero's last stand. When Odoacer reached Ravenna, the seat of power now far from the ruined glory of Rome, Romulus did not resist. There was nothing left to defend. The boy laid down the crown, and Odoacer, the barbarian general, did not place it upon his own brow. Instead, he sent it, the imperial diadem of the West, eastward, to Constantinople, to Emperor Zeno, with a message that rang like a dirge across history. There was no longer a need for 2 emperors, 1 Rome would suffice. And so, with parchment and silence, the Western Roman Empire died. But what is the death of an empire? Is it marked by the fall of cities or the crumbling of law? Is it the last legionnaire lowering his standard, or the whisper of forgotten names in a crumbling forum? Rome did not fall in fire. It fell into oblivion. The Senate still met, but it passed no laws. The people still prayed, but no one heard. The aqueducts still carried water, the roads still stretched across continents, the stones still bore Latin carvings. But the soul of Rome, the Pax Romana, the civic creed, the sense of destiny had vanished. And yet from its corpse strange airs arose. In Constantinople, the Eastern Empire, Byzantine in name, Roman in heart, remained defiant. There the Caesars endured. Cloaked in Greek, crowned in mosaics, guarded by flame and heresy, they ruled for another 1,000 years. The purple still flowed, though its thread was changed. In the West, another claimant whispered to life. The Bishop of Rome, once a servant among many, now stood amid ruins and found power in silence. The Church became what the Empire had ceased to be, a shepherd of laws, a guardian of souls, a voice that spoke Latin not to soldiers, but to God. Where emperors once ruled by sword, popes now ruled by scripture. And further still, in the shadows of the forests and the smoke of the northern tribes, a strange resurrection stirred. Centuries later, a Frankish king would kneel before a pope and rise as emperor of the Romans. Not a Roman by blood, not a Roman by tongue, but a Roman in name, a holy Roman emperor. The crown of Caesar, it seemed, refused to vanish. Even the rising caliphates, born of desert winds and revelation, would carry Rome's memory in ways strange and profound. They translated its science, preserved its wisdom, studied its logic, and wielded its dream of empire not with eagles but with verses. In Baghdad, in Cordoba, in Cairo, the Roman spirit flickered, quiet but burning. The fall of the West was not a collapse. It was a transformation, a dispersal of fire. In every monastery that copied a Roman text by candlelight. In every cathedral that crowned its dome like a Roman arch. In every knight who marched on paved roads to lands charted by centurions. In every law spoken in Latin, in every whisper of empire, Rome endured, but the city itself, the ancient heart, changed. Where once senators debated the fate of the world, goats now grazed. Statues wore ivy for cloaks. The Colosseum stood like a scar, filled not with the roar of crowds but with wind and memory. The Forum, once the beating pulse of law, trade, and speech, became a field of ruins and prayers. Still, the people lit candles. They sang in sanctuaries raised atop old temples. They walked streets laid by emperors and spoke names long dead, because Rome was not stone alone, it was an idea. And ideas once born do not die, they decay, they twist, they sleep, but somewhere they remain. 476 did not mark the fall of Rome. It marked the moment when Rome stepped from flesh into shadow, when it ceased to be a nation and became a myth, a ghost walking beside kings, a memory etched in gold and blood. The crown of Caesar was lifted from a child's head and carried unseen into the corridors of time. Twilight lingers long over fallen empires, and in that long dusk, Rome does not vanish, it becomes a myth. From the shattered domes of basilicas to the frostbitten peaks of northern monasteries, her breath remains. Not as dominion, not as decree, but as whisper, subtle, unyielding, eternal. The empire that ruled the world now rules memory, and memory is a throne no sword can unseat. Rome is gone, and yet she is everywhere. In the arches that hold bridges aloft, in the laws etched into marble tablets, in the coins buried deep in farmers' fields and pulled from the loam like relics of a forgotten divinity, in the Latin prayers that rise like incense toward heaven, and in the ink-stained hands of scribes who copy by candlelight the words of Cicero, of Virgil, of Caesar. The empire's flesh has perished, but her soul lingers in the script of civilization. She becomes a ghost, not haunting out of vengeance, but remembrance. Not far from where the Tiber winds through weeds and silence, pilgrims still tread the Via Appia, their feet pressing ancient dust into the earth. The road is cracked now, split by root and rain, but beneath it lies the stone Rome laid, measured, cut, and placed by men who once feared no end. Each footprint upon it is an echo. Each silence is filled with voices long dead yet still speaking, because empires do not die as men do. They linger, they shift from body to breath, from law to lore. And Rome is breath and law alike. Across the continent, kings who never saw the 7 hills take titles forged in her fire. They crown themselves Imperator, Caesar, Augustus, Pontifex. Their courts mimic her marble, their armies march to her drums, their banners unfurl in the shape of her eagle. They speak new tongues, pray new prayers, wield new powers, but they dream Roman dreams. To rule the world, to bind it with roads and rules, to place man at the heart of history. She survives in Byzantium's vaulted splendor, where emperors clad in golden thread chant Greek beneath Christian domes. There Rome becomes divine, a fusion of sword and scripture. Hagia Sophia rises like a second pantheon, one where angels hover instead of gods and saints replace senators. Even as the fires of war reach the Bosphorus, the Romans of the East do not forget their name. They are still Romulus. Still heirs to Caesar. Further still, across the waters and deserts, the caliphates inherit her hunger not for territory alone but for order. They read her works in Arabic, debate her laws, refine her logic. In Damascus and Baghdad, her intellect flickers as if her soul had found sanctuary not in marble palaces but in libraries and lanterns. Scholars preserve what generals could not. And in the West, where Rome's body had fallen to ash, her idea takes root in an unlikely sanctuary, the Church. Once persecuted in her arenas, Christianity now carries her legacy. Popes sit where Caesars once thundered. The Bishop of Rome becomes more than a shepherd, he becomes sovereign. Robed in humility but wielding the power of empire, he blesses kings and names emperors, his voice echoing with a Rome sanctified. And in time, the empire returns in name. Charlemagne, a Frankish warlord with no Roman blood, kneels before a pope and rises with a crown forged in the old imperial mold. The Holy Roman Empire, he declares, an echo, a resurrection, a myth made real by proclamation and belief. Though the Senate is dust, though the Tiber runs red only with rust, the crown of Caesar is reborn not in Latin cities but in the forest of Germania. Even in ruin, Rome commands awe. Artists chisel her beauty into stone again. Philosophers drink from her wisdom. Poets paint her as goddess, as ghost, as mother. Her myths endure: Romulus and Remus, Aeneas fleeing Troy, the wolf and the sword, the eagle and the laurel. She becomes more powerful in death than she ever was in life. Children grow up hearing her name with reverence. Soldiers march under her standards even when they know not what they mean. Architects mimic her vaults and domes. Lawgivers summon her ghosts when drafting codes. Nations rise, proclaiming themselves the third Rome, as if the first had never truly died, because it hadn't. It had simply stepped back from the world stage, not into darkness, but into legend. In every court of justice where fairness is blind and reason reigns, Rome speaks. In every library where scrolls and tomes line the shelves, Rome watches. In every ruined column kissed by ivy and rain, Rome dreams. In every cathedral bell and every republic's oath, Rome is not gone. She is remembered, and in that remembering reborn. The empires of today still dance in her shadow. The languages we speak, the rights we cherish, the fears we silence, all are shaped by that ancient forge. She may not march now, but she moves through us. And as the stars wheel through the night sky and centuries fall like petals from a burning tree, one truth endures: that empire once born never truly dies. It only becomes a story. And Rome is the greatest story ever told.